I was initially pretty confused when I saw this because usually history and media is sensationalist. It remembers things that stick in your head, such as the blimp that just got lost on the way to Britain and eventually found its way there, but couldn't find any sort of town, so just wandered around bombing whatever it could find, but it was just houses, so it just epically failed. It remembers things like that, and people who, like Hitler, who are just act so insane for some unknown reason that you don't know what to make of them. And instead of that, we have the more calm, quiet example who's relatively famous, and the person who is charismatic and a bit more political, who, hardly anybody who has heard of him. Although it's, awareness has gone up in the last few years. Mengele was interested in proving, getting support for the new thing, the fad of eugenics with his experiments. So he would, and he was interested to see how genetics and eugenics played into each other. So he would take a couple of sets of twins and say, okay, how do their genetics influence their personality? Why are they inferior to me? And so he would do things like, he would manipulate them to see if there was any change in his personality, their personality, and if one could sense the other changing. He did some pretty horrible things like sewing people together and sewing identical twins together, and a lot more things.
Yeah.
Yet to, yes. All right. Mengele's main playground was Auschwitz, and yes, I know that's terribly politically incorrect to say Auschwitz was his playground, but it really was. He treated it. He was the king of it. And he could decide who lived and who died and how they died with a flip with just a point of a finger. He did a bunch of different experiments, but the one that stuck in my head was the story of Eva Kor, who she was a survivor, which is how I know that she went through this. She and her sister were taken to Auschwitz, tattooed. Auschwitz was the only concentration camp that tattooed its inmates, by the way. Buchenwald, or however you pronounce that one, did not. It was just this one. And then every Tuesday and Thursday, they had blood taken from them, and some sort of poison or pathogen, they don't know which because they never found their files, injected into the other arm. Then every other day, except for Sunday, Mengele would observe them to see if their arms were the same length and how much they were growing, and so they would have to sit or stand naked every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the entire day while these people observed and measured them. Eva fell ill after one of these injections and was taken to the hospital. Well, against her will, because the rumor was that whoever went into the hospital never came back. She remembers Dr. Mengele looking at her fever chart, looking at her, laughing and saying, "Oh, this woman will die." She decided to prove him wrong and ruin his experiment, so she survived. But when she got back to Miriam, she found out that Miriam had been kept in isolation for the entire time. She was constantly being observed, and Eva had recuperated, and they immediately injected her with many things. They don't know what it was. But for whatever reason, her kidneys never grew beyond the size of a 10-year-old girl's from that day forward. She died in the 1980s, I believe, Miriam did. So that's just one of his experiments. He did all sorts of other things. And all of this was to try to figure out how genetics influenced people, and if you had the same genetics as you did with identical twins, if you sort of had the same personality and some mysterious connection. He also, I guess he also wanted to figure out how the germs progressed, because for science, which is why we rely on epidemiological studies, you have to have a study group and a control group. Eva was the study group, and if she had died, Miriam would have been immediately killed, and they would have run the comparative autopsies to try to figure out how the germs worked, how they progressed. To say Ping Fan was Shiro Ishii's Auschwitz is a little bit misleading. It's more accurate to say that all of China was Shiro Ishii's Auschwitz, or at least all conquered territory. Ping Fan was the major base of an entire network of camps. They produced tens of, 30 million bacteria a day, I believe, at their peak capacity. I've got a list here of just the ones from this one. Like, there were other camps that were producing bacteria in other places. 1 second. Okay. Ping Fan alone produced typhus, typhoid, anthrax, cholera, plague, which is the Black Death, salmonella, tetanus, botulism, brucellosis, hopefully, gas gangrene, smallpox, tick encephalitis, tuberculosis, and a few more. These were, his main experiments were divided into two chunks. The ones where he would research on the POWs, where here he was more scientific than Mengele, because in Mengele's camps, they were kept in such terrible conditions that they would have died well before the average. So the data that Mengele got was inherently skewed. In Ping Fan, all the POWs were were fed on soldiers' rations and given exercise breaks, and weren't supposed to work at all until they were killed by biological experimentation, which and he would test bombs and infect them with diseases. But the thing is, with Shiro Ishii, he didn't limit himself to a camp, and he didn't limit himself to prisoners. He is known to have run airdrops, or at least one of them, in which bubonic plague, Black Death, was sprinkled all over Manchuria. He wanted to study epidemiology, like how, not just how epidemics happen, but how to create an epidemic. So the figure on how many Chinese people died is 20 to 30 million. But that probably is low because, well, they were a little bit ashamed of what they were doing, and they didn't want to really publish the real figures. The worst experimentation on the populace happened at Nanjing, I believe, because here was where people were, like, he would lace chocolates with anthrax and then give them to kids to see if it would see what would happen. He would encrust like walking staffs with typhoid and like leave it along a walking a path or foods or anything, and see exactly which ones created the best epidemic. Now, back to my question of why is one more famous than the other. I think Shiro Ishii was worse. But one of the reasons that he isn't as famous is that the U.S. actually paid aid for for what he learned in the experimentation with by agreeing not to let this go to trial in a big way. And we use that information to revamp our biological weapons division, even though that's outlawed by the Geneva Convention, which we actually ratified. And so there's the lack of information. Secondly, I think that it's just the personas. Shiro Ishii's own daughter said that if he hadn't been a medical doctor, he might have been a politician. We don't tend to trust politicians very much. But Mendele was a bit more doctory. He was a little, and it's difficult to explain. He had a little bit more of that calm, cool, removed bit to him than Ishii did. And the last bit that I think, the last reason why I think it didn't catch on in the States is just general disinterest with Eastern culture. I mean, unfortunately, you can't see the places it's happening to. You don't know much about how the people it is happening to, and it just becomes a statistic for you to forget about.